Hi, I'm Bronwyn Williams. We're back with the Flux 15-minute foreplay conversations with my colleague, Tumelo Mojapelo. And today our guest is Reanna Browne. And Reanna, we have one really important topic we want to talk to you about today. And that is, why is it that so many foresight initiatives fail? Or why is it that it seems to be so hard for people to take foresight in theory into foresight in practice? In other words, to actually change the world rather than just talk about changing it.
Okay. So I think a starting point is the sense that is this about a failure to act on insights? So for me, in this work, I've always been really interested in the before and the after of things. So we might do the scanning work and the research and the scenario work, but I've been very curious about what happens in before that. So how do we set up the conversation, and then what happens after? When I first got into the future space, I used to find it really interesting, but not important enough to do anything come Monday. So what happens between the end of that futures conversation, whatever that input is, and the actual actions? What might we do come Monday? One thing that I think is really important to share is after 12 or 13 years in this space, I very quickly learned that data and insights alone don't change minds. For me, if you're thinking about the insights and data that you have, but you're thinking about it with the same assumptions about the future, then you'll ignore the changes. So a really candid example, 10 years ago, I was working with an organization and the CEO said to me after a scanning piece, "I hope you're ready for tension between two executives." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Well, the head of finance is going to say, don't do anything different, keep the lights on. And the head of strategy and change is going to say, if we don't do anything different, we won't have lights to keep on." So part of what I realized was it doesn't matter how profound the insights were or the trends were, if I didn't go upstream and challenge how they thought about the future in the first place. So one of the acupuncture points for me is to say, but first we need to challenge how we think about the future. It's not out there and then, it never arrives. We're always in the present. It's shaped by action and inaction. When people get a shift in that thinking, then they tend to listen differently about the changes that are occurring or the trends that you're sharing or the scenarios. Then the other part is to say, how do we help them tie threads between those insights and actions come Monday? And I think that before and after bit is really crucial and what's missing in a lot of our foresight work.
That's very interesting. So how would you then tie that? So tie the foresight part about talking into the practice part. So how do you tie those two bits together? What would you do if you're working with an organization? What would you be like? What would you actually focus on? Because like you said, most companies come in, they do the scanning exercises, they do the scenario building, they do all the methodologies and stuff, right? And then come Monday, nothing's happening, birds are chirping, it's business as usual. So like, what would you advise any leader on like what they need to do to ensure that at least someone takes the first step in shifting the mindset? Because maybe that's the only action that needs to happen, or actually actively or proactively start engaging in behavior that actually slowly brings about change or transformation.
I think you've touched on a little bit of it there. So for me, with all of my work, even if I'm brought on explicitly for a piece of research, I say yes, but first we're going to start with this unlearning primer, which is a terrible term because it's really just learning, but it's a useful one in the sense that people recognize that they'll be shifting their thinking. And I fold that into any work I do at the start. It's almost like an essential thing to start with. So thereafter, when we're talking about the change, we're listening and we're seeing it with very different eyes and ears. We're not dismissing it and saying it's out there and then and that we're too busy, because we've learned that saying we're too busy means we're not doing a lot of things, which usually means a future of constraint. Then the other end, I think from an action perspective, it's really crucial, and I'm quite obsessed with granularity in actions. How do we take these great insights, and how do we have a conversation that says, so what are the implications and opportunities, not just defense here, and now what actions? So I really frame things through the lens of small bets in a longer game, micro actions. how do we get much more granular? If you're trying to make big changes, it doesn't matter. Big changes still start from where we are today, and they start in the near term. So it's kind of watching leaders' shoulders drop, because it's like, oh, if that's all I need to do, this next adjacent thing from where I am, the best metaphor is, think about a plane changing trajectory by like 2 degrees, 10 degrees, it ends up somewhere very different. And I feel like it comes back to two of the most essential things that I think good foresight work is about, which is agency and pathways. How do people walk away with a sense of having some capacity to influence and a pathway from where they are today, not like being overwhelmed of like, I don't know how to get where I am today to, this kind of broader space that we want to be moving towards. So it's really bringing action down in concrete, small, practical ways come Monday.
Okay, so you brought the actions down to small concrete pieces, right? But why do you feel like people sometimes either freeze or fight? I don't know if I'm making sense. So why do they have this great resistance to change or pivot? What have you noticed? What are the observations that you've made? What are the reasons why, when you now help them to literally break this up into small little granular actions, right? They still are either fleeing, I'm gonna throw in fleeing as well. So they're running away from the problem and hiding away from it, or the action, or they freeze, or sometimes they fight. So they push back on maybe actually doing those little changes or the minor tweaks, like that 2% degree change, so that they can actually be on a different pathway than they are.
Probably two layers of thinking about this, and it's almost like a running hypothesis in my work. And the top layer is to say, maybe if we get people to think differently about the future, and we get people to think differently about action, where it feels easy and we have agency and there are pathways, and it helps us give a sense that we can enact a sense of change, does that then result in actual different behavior? Hopefully, yes. The other thing, and this is almost like a personal practice question, is honestly to think about the fact in my own life, I think, well, why, in spite of so much evidence, haven't I done something different? Why haven't I changed? And it might be evidence from a doctor, it might be evidence from a hairdresser, it doesn't matter. The same kind of questions applies to my practice. And this is almost a dual track that I'm playing, is testing the different ways of helping create conditions for people to act, do a different thing come Monday. But then the back end as a personal professional practice is to really consider the nervous system in the context of change. And so for me, there's a difference between knowing about the need to change and actually doing something differently. We often assume that people will rationally choose a response, but in reality, it's actually our nervous system's autonomic response that plays a huge role, especially when the change is confronting. If it's aligned with our beliefs, it's fine, it's easy, we'll probably go and do it. If the change is challenging, if you think about a lot of the complex challenges and even existential challenges that even organizations are starting to talk about, some of that is very challenging, and you immediately get a nervous system response. So for me, the question is, what does that mean from a practice perspective? But our ability to be curious and explore what's changing is directly related to our ability to feel safe and settled in a process. So we can't be imaginative and think about change if we're sitting there and we're in like the freeze response. So part of the work, I think, is for change to happen. It's what are the processes, even stealth, that we start using that allow us to engage from the bottom of the brain up. So how do we address those feelings of safety and regulation so we can actually start to have those conversations about change? Putting content or data or insights in front of people that creates huge amounts of dysregulation, even if it's essential and we're trying to deal with big problems and that needs serious responses, shuts us into a state of kind of panic, and we know we make very narrow decisions. So for me, I've started to almost by stealth explore things like somatic practices in my work. Like, how do I create conditions where people can just exhale a bit when we're talking about some of the harder challenges around this work, or the more confronting changes? It's almost a bit of a neurosequential foresight. And tiny things come back to, I guess, achievable next steps, agency and pathways, dosing. You know, you don't want to drop massive existential things on people and expect radical change come Monday. So it's a really elegant question of the practice, to be honest. And I think the indicators for me always come back to, yeah, but what have I done, or when have I changed as a person in response to a big challenge? What can I learn about my own processes of change?
I just want to highlight something that you said about how, basically it's how I understand it. You have to create that space where people feel like they are, like you said, they can take a deep breath, right? They feel safe enough to literally start dipping their feet into the data, or maybe just the practice of slowly getting into the pathway of a different pathway, a different way of thinking. What do you do? Like, because I'm a leader and I'm watching this. I'm like, this is so fascinating because I never even thought about that. It's not just about being presented with data, but it is also down to our neurology, our physiology, and how we respond to certain situations. How can I then create the conditions around me to be able to be open to, like what you said, microdosing bits of data. So like dosing them with bits of data. So how can I create that environment? Because I think the dosing part is easy because you can segment information and everything, but it's creating that environment that when you actually slowly start drip feeding this information and this data and this new way of thinking, people absorb it. So what would you say from like a simple way? Just how do you create that atmosphere of calm, or maybe like a deep release, a sigh, like, whew, now I can take this on because I'm not holding myself and my body's not tight and I'm not like feeling agitated.
A friend once said to me, and I found it initially quite confronting, but it was a great way of describing good futures work. She said, "You're my most and least favorite dinner guest in the same evening." And for me, what it made me realize is I think that's good futures, is being able to have hard conversations about very big, serious things that are going on at the moment, and also hopeful conversations. Part of what I do naturally is to look for the former, like what are the hard things, what are the things we're not talking about. But part of my own practice is to look more intentionally at hopeful signals of change as well. So I think that's one element. Good futures practice allows us to do both. It's not just pop and hopeful conversations and ignoring the shadow that's actually really foundational and structurally challenging. It also allows us to talk about the stuff that we might not want to be talking about but are experiencing and knowing. From a practice perspective, I think a lot of it comes down to, there's the emerging part around the neurosequential kind of safety and the dosing, but at a really basic level for me, it comes down to agency and pathways, and a sense that this work isn't about trying to get the future precisely right. It's almost like once you let go of that, there's almost like a relief in that. The work is about what is changing, what's the adjacent possible from where we are, what's changing at the edge of today, and what can I do at the edge of where I'm at right now with what I have. So I think I use agency and pathways as a really powerful way to talk about the hard stuff and the hopeful stuff, and to leave people with a sense of, I guess, slightly more hopeful and agentic ideas about the future. I'll give you a really tiny example of that. Running a process with graduates, and a lot of people know, particularly in Australia, slight generalization, but there's a lot of data that says young people are increasingly, they're losing a lot of agency. They feel like they can't influence things. They're becoming more pessimistic. I ran a session with graduates, and part of it was to teach them to think differently about the future, then to explore change, the adjacent possible, changes at the edge of today, not what might happen 20 or 30 years' time, like what is happening now and how could that play out? And then what is your adjacent possible? What's at the edge of what you can do today? So that sense of agency kind of come Monday. And one of them texted me after and said, "I've been feeling really depressed about work in general, and I had a real shift today." So for me, it's kind of that stuff that I think is the most impactful. And there's a change energy that comes from a shift in agency. It's like, okay, I feel like I can do a thing. I feel like I've got a little bit more influence over my own life and my own career. And my own theory of change is that changing and creating that shift and change energy and agency and pathways for individuals is consequential. at a macro level. I can't change enormous systems. I don't even pretend to try to. I really work with individuals in a collective setting and think, how can I shift a sense of agency and pathways in them, thereafter some change, some energy for change from where they are today.
Do you find, especially based on this case study that you shared about the student, do you find that once someone, so that an individual takes action and decides that they're going to be, like you said, the change at the edge of what they are able to do, right? Do you find that that's contagious? Does it create ripples? Do you find that other people also pick up that, I want to call it vibe, because it seems a bit fluffy, but do they pick up that same energy, or do they also feel encouraged that they can also do something within their sphere of influence? Or is this just that one person running out into the distant future, feeling able to do anything that they can, and no one else is like picking up on that? Is it contagious?
Look, I think it is. I mean, we don't come together as much as we used to, so it's hard to tell because we're all doing this individually. But my theory of change and impact is that it is consequential at a collective level. And again, I just, small rudders change big ships. So really reducing the bigness. And don't get me wrong, if you're in crisis and chaos, it is a very different kind of orientation for decision making. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about a space where we do have some capacity to kind of shape things, even if there's big constraints. But my view is that that type of individual change is very consequential because we are relational beings. And it is also self-reinforcing. It's the butterfly effect, I guess, in a way that it can have bigger impacts.
And you just mentioned that, okay, this is for a setting where like you have a bit of control, right? And you just mentioned that in crisis, sometimes you'd have to have a different approach. I'm hoping like you're not getting over me with these questions, but I just wanted to find out in crisis, right then, how would you then act come Monday? I don't know if I'm making sense. So like I don't know, the ship burns, you trying to decant water the bucket. I mean, you're a leader and it's really bad. And come Monday, like, how do you then, like, what would change in your perspective? How would you then act in a way in that kind of situation?
I think you kind of touched on it. I think you just have to act. You can't literally say, well, we're just going to step back and see what's changing and then make a call. You just have to act and then kind of see. You're not really sensing and then deciding. It's just like, we have to do a thing, because not doing a thing is equally as consequential. So I think it is much more about do and then quickly learn. But inaction is consequential in a state of crisis. We kind of think if we do nothing, that will be a safer bet. I mean, even in general, to be honest, not even in crisis, the default for organizations to think that inaction is a safer bet, I tend to say, is increasingly less so. So the more, I call it the tyranny of the urgent, the more that we think we're too busy to think about the future, the more likely we've ignored a whole changing context around us. Not only we miss opportunities for innovation and changing what we're doing in the present, but the more likely a future of constraint where things have shifted and we have to make radical kind of redirections. And for me, the whole point is, how can we use insights about what's changing, the adjacent possible to what's changing at the edge of today, to make more informed decisions, more resilient decisions, more innovative decisions, more kind of preferred decisions in the present.
Thank you so much, Reanna, for your time and your insight. This is very interesting. The conversation could go on and on and on. I had more questions to ask, but unfortunately, it's a 15-minute conversation. For those who are viewing, please continue to follow other conversations. Share this conversation, subscribe, like, and join us for more 15-minute conversations. Thank you so much, Reanna.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me on.